Mr. Bravo's Seaside Adventure. Horses are extremely hard-working animals, and Mr. Bravo, who was the Scratton family's horse, was no exception. He lived in the stables behind the house, and the family relied on him to pull the carriage that took them into town for shopping trips, running errands, and calling on friends and family. Despite his advancing years, he was still a fit and handsome-looking animal, with a glossy chestnut-coloured coat, a long white mane and tail, and a muzzle as soft as velvet. It was true he had a few grey hairs, but he felt they made him look very distinguished and wise. The Scratton children loved Mr. Bravo, and due to his steady and patient nature, was an excellent horse upon which to learn to ride, especially if they were a little nervous. He didn't particularly mind being ridden, but did get a bit fed up when young Barbara insisted on bringing several of her toys along to accompany her during her lessons, which were stuffed into saddlebags and attached to his back. The toys would all bounce along as they rode, and one particularly irksome doll would cry, "Mama!" every time Mr. Bravo's hooves hit the ground. He was most pleased when one day it fell from the saddlebag and smashed to the floor, with one final "Mama!" before falling silent. In turn for his hard work, the family ensured he was well fed, had a warm, cosy stable in which to sleep, and had his tail and mane regularly brushed to keep them clean and silky smooth. When all was said and done, Mr. Bravo led a contented life, apart from one thing. The one thing that he wanted above all else, more than a brushed tail or an extra apple with his dinner. He wanted a day off. A whole day to do exactly what he wanted and to go wherever he pleased. "It's not that I'm ungrateful to the family," he said to Mrs. Nan one day as they were enjoying some morning sun in the stable yard before he went off on his first errand. "But I would like a day off from wearing all this get-up or having small children on my back who wipes their sticky hands and runny noses on my mane." Mrs. Nan sympathised with his plight, but questioned, "What would you do on your day off, Mr. Bravo?" The horse considered this for a short while, and then replied, "A day out is what I'd have. A nice day out." "But where would you go?" quizzed Mrs. Nan curiously. "Dunno," he replied. "I'd follow me nose, let me hooves take them where they pleased, I suppose." And with this, the little dog raised her eyebrows, gave a quick nod, and trotted off to find her son Binks, who she'd last spotted digging up one of Mr. Scratton's newly planted flower beds, and just in time it seemed, as at that moment Mr. Scratton could be spotted striding across the lawn to the stables to prepare the carriage in readiness for a trip to town. Mr. Scratton often went out alone and enjoyed time spent with just him, the horse, and the open road. He liked to watch the world go by with just the steady sound of the clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the hard ground and the jingle-jangle of the harness as the carriage rolled along. For his part, Mr. Bravo got to catch a glimpse of life outside the family home, and perhaps it was this that made him yearn for an adventure beyond the gates of the park where he lived. The day in question was like any other, as they travelled the familiar route out through the park gates, past the water pump on the corner, and onto the main highway. Except that on this occasion, Mr. Scratton had a lot of extra tasks to complete, and a long list of goods to pick up from the shops, including several requests from the children for items that they desperately needed. This meant that he was a little more distracted than usual, taking a slightly different route into town, and therefore didn't park the carriage in its usual spot at the top of the high street, but at the far end near the coast, which was unfamiliar to Mr. Bravo, as he didn't accompany the family on day trips to the seaside. "Right, old chap," said Mr. Scratton as he jumped down from his seat and hastily secured the carriage. "I'll only be a short while, and don't worry, lad, I know this isn't our usual spot, but it's nice and quiet here and you're out of the sun." And he gave the horse a reassuring pat, followed by an affectionate muzzle rub, as he really was very fond of his reliable and faithful companion. Mr. Scratton then dashed off up the high street and was soon out of sight, leaving Mr. Bravo alone. On any other day this would be quite normal, and the horse would wait patiently until his master returned without much fuss or bother. But today was different, as, in his haste to complete his long list of duties, Mr. Scratton hadn't secured the carriage properly, and had in fact loosened the harness, which, as Mr. Bravo was about to find out, would unexpectedly give him the day off he'd been dreaming of. The first Mr. Bravo knew that he was free of his shackles was when he had his customary shakedown, which he did regularly to loosen his muscles after pulling the carriage. He began with a neck roll, then a shoulder shimmy, followed by a quick wiggle of the withers, and finishing off with a back bounce. And it was this that caused the harness to drop with a jolt, and Mr. Bravo was free. He stood in shock for a moment at first as the familiar weight of the carriage disappeared. He shook his head, and off fell the bridle. Then, as it slowly dawned on him that he was now able to go wherever he pleased, he gave a small whinny of delight and trotted off in the direction of the beach. Mr. Bravo had never ventured this far on his own before, and was used to the familiar surroundings of the house, his stable, and the park, so this was a whole new experience of sights, sounds, and smells. He slowly made his way down to the beachfront, taking great care over the uneven cobbled road that led to the shore. It was late in the year, and the beach was deserted, and all he could see were the hazy, dark shapes of wading birds silhouetted against the horizon, and the wonderful sensation of the breeze that was drifting across the water. It created ripples across the surface that reminded him of the walled garden back home, when the soil in the vegetable beds was being prepared, ready to plant. He smiled at this thought and wondered what all the other animals would say if they could see what an adventure he was having. As he stood enjoying the feel of the wind through his mane and the strange but not unpleasant smell of the salty air, he heard a faint scratching at his feet, and was about to move one of his hooves when a cry of, "Here, watch out, Squire, you nearly had my shell off there." Mr. Bravo looked down to see where the voice was coming from, and saw a small creature looking up at him, with wobbly eyes on stalks and tiny spiky legs protruding from the shell on its back. At the front of the shell were a pair of alarmingly sharp-looking claws which it was waving about with great gusto. The creature was a crab, and it had been foraging through the sandy stones, minding its own business, when this enormous beast came and disturbed its efforts. Mr. Bravo had never seen anything like it before, and was quite taken aback, but, remembering his manners, said to the crab, "I do beg your pardon. I'm inclined to be a little clumsy on uneven ground, and I hope I have not damaged your person in any way." And with this he lowered his head in recognition that this was the crab's domain and not his. The little crab by now had ceased waving its claws and scuttled sideways to get a better view of its new visitor. "That's quite all right, Squire," it replied. "No damage done, and no offence taken. So what brings you to this neck of the woods, then?" Mr. Bravo was sure they were nowhere near the woods, as he hadn't spotted any trees, but decided it was probably best not to mention this to the crab, who looked like it was quite nifty with those claws. Instead, he explained what had happened, and how he had ended up on the beach, and was now enjoying a day out. The crab scuttled sideways again across the pebbles, and peered up at the horse, saying, "Well, if it's a day out you want, you've come to the right place," and pointing a claw continued, "If you keep walking that way, you'll arrive at the pier, which is a sight to behold, and if I may say, a marvellous place to have a forage. Good lot of stones down there, nice and slimy." The horse thanked the crab for its advice, and said he would be certain to visit the pier, as it sounded most interesting, to which the crab gave a wave of its claw, and with a final, "Cheerio then, Squire," went back to scavenging the shoreline. Mr. Bravo started to walk in the direction the crab had shown him, the sun shining on his back and the gentle breeze still buffeting the air, carrying aloft the plaintive cries of the gulls which flew overhead. He ventured a little closer to the water's edge and found it much firmer underfoot as the stony ground transformed to golden sand. The water felt good on his hooves as he walked, the wet sand slurped beneath him. A feeling came over Mr. Bravo as he continued along the vast stretch of coastline. A feeling as though the breeze was daring him to run, whipping at his senses, and he did not resist its call. He began to trot, and very soon the trot became a gallop, and the gallop became a canter as he raced along the shore. He had not run this fast since he was a young colt, and felt the years melt away as his hooves thundered across the sand. It wasn't long before Mr. Bravo arrived at the pier, and it was indeed a magnificent sight. Stretching out across the water, its mass of metal legs reminded him of the millipedes that lived in the log pile near the stables, and again his mind drifted home once more. He imagined what his friends were doing and felt a slight yearning to be back there with them. He quickly shook this feeling off, as this was his day out and he was going to enjoy it. He was quite hot from his run, and underneath the pier it looked cool and inviting, so he made his way over to shelter for a while. The ground beneath his hooves felt muddier and wetter than before, and the rocks that protruded through the water were slippery and mottled green with algae, but the temptation of a shady spot was too hard to resist, and he ventured further under the structure. Just as he was getting settled for a well-earned rest, he heard a shuffling sound, and glancing through one of the pier's rusty iron supports, he saw a face. A kindly face, with large round eyes, a smiley mouth, and whiskers on its short snout. The seal gazed back at Mr. Bravo, and let out a strange honking laugh that sounded somewhat like the bicycle horn Humphrey had received one birthday and drove everybody mad with the noise. "Ha, ha, ha! Hello there! Don't you look funny all covered in mud?" chuckled the seal. "I haven't seen you here before. You waited for the tide to come in?" Mr. Bravo was somewhat bemused by the animal's distinct lack of any grace or manners, but politely informed the seal that he had just had a run along the beach and was taking a short rest before heading back. "Oh, you don't want to run," chortled the seal. "You want to swim. Much nicer, and you cool off at the same time. Bit wet for some, but I'm always ready for a dip," and slapping its flippers together in delight, let out another loud laugh. "Ha, ha, ha!" Thought Mr. Bravo. "They're a strange lot here and no mistake," but simply nodded politely and, leaning against the pier support, closed his eyes and let the sound of the waves lapping against the rocks soothe his weary bones. He soon drifted off to sleep, waking some time later to find the light fading and the sun now setting in the sky. The seal was nowhere to be seen, and to his horror he could feel the water was higher now as the tide was coming in. Mr. Bravo knew he must get back to where Mr. Scratton had left the carriage, and started to lift his hooves out of the water. But try as he might, he was stuck fast in the sludgy, squelchy mud. The more he tried to move, the more he became trapped, and the water was coming in faster now. Oh, how Mr. Bravo longed to be back home, and wished he'd never had the silly idea of having a day out by himself. He started to whinny in the vain hope that someone would hear him, but the beach was empty. Nobody was there. Just as he'd given up all hope, he saw a faint light, like a firefly bobbing around up ahead. And as the light got closer, he could just make out the shape of a man. The man didn't look familiar, but Mr. Bravo didn't care. He was going to be rescued. "Well, well, what have we here?" said the man as he scrambled under the pier to reach the horse. "A poor soul in need of rescue." And he patted Mr. Bravo's neck and carefully began to free his hooves from the mud. After some pulling and tugging, he was free, and the man led the poor bedraggled horse up the beach to safer ground, where he had a bucket of water ready to clean Mr. Bravo's legs. Mr. Bravo nuzzled the man's hand in gratitude, and was rewarded with another pat on the shoulder. Out of the gloom he heard a familiar voice. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Bradley. Thank you so much. I've been so worried. Oh, poor Bravo." And he ran to where his horse stood with his rescuer. He shook Mr. Bradley firmly by the hand. "Thank goodness you heard him. I can't bear to think what might have happened if you hadn't." "Well, Mr. Scratton, that's my job as pier headman, patrolling the shore and keeping everyone out of trouble, including horses," he said with a twinkle in his eye. It was twilight when they finally arrived back home, to the relief of the family, and of course the other animals, who had been beside themselves with worry. Fortunately, Mr. Bravo was none the worse for wear, and after a hearty dinner and a good night's rest in his warm, dry stable, he was soon back to his old self. The next day he was due to take Barbara out for a riding lesson, and she was waiting at the front of the house, toys at the ready and eager to get going. "Look what Daddy bought me yesterday, Mr. Bravo," the little girl said excitedly as Mr. Scratton prepared to lift his daughter into the saddle. "A new dolly, and she can speak." Barbara wiggled the doll, which promptly bleated, "Mama." Mr. Bravo didn't mind, as he was happy to be home and knew that this was far better than being stuck in the mud.